Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Mike Grier's third full season as San Jose Sharks general manager, grading it based on the trades, signings, and waiver wire pickups that he has made since the beginning of last year's offseason to this year's trade deadline. This is not a list of every single move that has got done. Not going to be talking about some of the more minor deals like picking up Walker Duehr off of waivers or trading Justin Bailey for Pavel Regenda. Instead, focusing on the transactions that actually had a direct impact on the Sharks NHL roster. Starting off with the least recent of them all, the waiver wire pickup of Barclay Goodrow, which ends up getting the worst possible grade here of an F for multiple reasons. The first of which, simply put, is that Barclay Goodrow was quite bad this season, and it should not come as a surprise to anybody within the San Jose Sharks organization. It is not the case that he played very well last season and then completely fell off a cliff. Even on a President's Trophy winning New York Rangers team, he had very bad stats. And so making the jump now to a league worst San Jose Sharks, no one could have possibly expected him to get all that much better. And in fact, he took a step back. Not only was he the worst 5-on-5 player on the Sharks, he was one of the worst 5-on-5 players in the entire league. When he was on the ice, the Sharks were heavily outshot, they were heavily outchanced, they were heavily outscored, just a general negative impact player at even strength. But there were two saving graces here for Barclay Goodrow. The first of which is that on the penalty kill, he actually is rather serviceable, not too bad in this area. And the second of which is that he does bring certain intangibles to the table that Ryan Warsofsky and Mike Grier are a big fan of. Whether that be his leadership or his physicality or his ability to play the right way, so to speak, having him buried on a Sharks fourth line here, not quite the end of the world. It did take a while to actually get to that point this year before Ryan Warsofsky did realize that he should just be burying him on the fourth line. But again, this is the type of move that just on the surface here is maybe like a C- type of acquisition, but there are two more reasons that cause this dramatic drop off of this grade. The next of which is the contract situation. The player who I have just described, you might be willing to give a league minimum contract to for just a single season. But Barclay Goodrow is making $3.6 million, a massive overpayment. I wouldn't even be giving him half of that. And this is not an expiring deal, but instead one that has another year and then another year on that for left before it actually runs out. Now, it's not going to be a huge roadblock for the Sharks to deal with because it does coincide with the endings of both Will Smith and Macklin Celebrini's entry-level contracts. So by the time the Sharks have to dish out real money here, Goodrow will be off the books, but it is still just a bad look to have such a terrible contract within the team at this point. But even that really only puts it as like a D, maybe D- type of move. The real clincher here, what gets this the worst possible grade, is the fact that when Barclay Goodrow originally negotiated his contract with the New York Rangers, he got himself a no-trade clause, which allowed him to have a limited list of teams that he could refuse a trade to. And the Sharks were on that list. I don't think he had anything against San Jose as a city or as a team, but simply put, for the remainder of his contract, the last few years of his career, he wants to remain on a playoff competitive team, which very clearly the Sharks are not. And so Rangers general manager Chris Drury and Sharks general manager Mike Grier circumvented this no-trade clause by putting him on waivers so that the Sharks could pick him up. And this is such a mind-boggling move that San Jose would force a player who specifically has it in writing that he does not want to play for your team, that they would force him to come anyway. And so for Mike Grier and Barclay Goodrow, maybe they had some sort of conversation behind the scenes and got themselves on the same page, but it is still just absolutely crazy to me that this ever happened in the first place. So for sure, to me, this was a failure that deserves the grade of an F. But from here on out, it does get better for Mike Grier for sure through the offseason. The next deal is Ty Dellandrea. Not much better on this case. It is one of many moves for Grier that he attempted to make to address the Sharks' bottom six that really didn't end up working out. In the case of Dellandrea, in fact, his stats were really no better than Barclay Goodrow, who I just got done eviscerating. And so this is not really a positive player for the Sharks. And the reason it does end up getting slightly below the kind of average grade of a C is the fact that the Sharks do give up an asset to bring this player over, a 4th rounder. Now, I'm not going to be sitting here and saying that a 4th round pick is so valuable that it's such a tragedy that the Sharks lost out on it, but the fact is that Ty Dellandrea is such a replacement level 4th liner and has played as such that a 4th round pick I'd honestly probably rather have at this point. Not to mention, if you go a little bit further up on the trade tree, and maybe this is somewhat unfair to hold against this deal, but this ends up kind of being a trade of Mikey Eyssimont for Ty Dellandrea, because that's how they got the 4th round pick in the first place, and that is a massive loss, and so I give this grade of a C-. The next trade, however, is one of the first of many home runs that Mike Grier had this offseason, that being the Jake Walman deal. Now, it's kind of hard to give Mike Grier full credit for this one because it's just such a strange and massive win for the team that there clearly was some sort of driving force behind why this trade actually got done in the first place. Many have theorized possible reasons, whether that's the Detroit Red Wings not really liking Jake Walman's attitude, or certain Red Wings players not really liking him, or perhaps there was some grand scheme in place to try and get Jacob Trouba from the Rangers to the Red Wings, and this really took into part the Walman trade and the Goodrow waiver wire pickup, but then the deal for Trouba fell apart, and then these trades still ended up happening. Whatever the case may be, the fact of the matter is that at the end of the day, the Sharks got a top 4 defenseman who was able to play in a number 1 role for the Sharks for many months before they flipped him at the deadline, and they got this player entirely for free. And not only that, they also picked up a 2nd round pick for their troubles. It is just a huge win that, again, I'm not going to give massive credit towards Mike Grier. It's kind of like taking candy from a baby, but you cannot possibly argue that this is not one of the more lopsided trades we have seen in a long time. It is absolutely deserving of an A+. The next move here is one that did have a lot more forethought behind it and ended up being a huge victory for the Sharks, which is that they traded up from 14th overall to 11th overall by getting rid of the 2nd round pick acquired in the Timo Meier trade from the New Jersey Devils. Now, this is normally like, you see these types of trades all the time on draft day, the ability to move up a couple of spots in the first round, things like that. But what made this one so interesting is the fact that it does not happen on the day of the draft, but instead before it. And a lot of people were kind of scratching their heads at why Mike Grier wouldn't have been more patient, thinking that maybe he jumped the gun a little bit. But actually, it ends up working out exceptionally well. The reason for this is that the Sharks, they had the 1st overall pick. It was known that they were going to take Macklin Celebrini, but with their 14th overall, they would want to pick up a defensive prospect, something that they were very much lacking within their system. And so this draft had a specific top group of 6 defensemen who seemed to have the most potential: Levshunov, Salayev, Parik, Yakimchuk, Buyum, and Sam Dickinson. And it was not expected that any of these 6 defensemen would actually still be available at number 14. The closest was thought to be Yakimchuk, who might go in like the 11 to 13 range, but it was rather unlikely. And so moving up to 11 was smart, but you would say, oh, but that could have been done on draft day anyway. But the thing is that because of how those top 10 selections went, with a surprise selection of Beckett Seneca at number 3 by the Anaheim Ducks and a surprise selection of Carter Yakimchuk at number 7 by the Ottawa Senators, when the 11th round pick came around, the Sharks not only could take one of these defensemen, but actually had an option between Sam Dickinson and Zeev Buyum. And by the time 14th came around, both were absolutely off the board. And so had the Sharks waited until the draft and it got to the point where the Buffalo Sabres were on the clock at number 11, if they had seen those 2 defensemen on the board still, they may have raised the price of such a move up. Maybe instead of taking the Devils' 2nd round pick, they would have requested the Sharks' 2nd round pick, the one that was 33rd overall, the one that was used to pick up Igor Chernyshov, that would have been really sad to see the Sharks move on from. Or perhaps the Sabres would have just said no to the trade entirely, drafted one of Dickinson or Buyum for themselves, and then the Sharks would be left with nothing at number 14. So Mike Grier doing this the day before the draft, perhaps with an idea that there would be that selection available for him at 11, was very, very smart. So to me, this is a home run, another A+ deal. Then we move on to the Carl Grundstrom trade. This is another one of those deals that really doesn't move the needle in any which direction. The Sharks don't give up an actual real asset to pick up this player. They trade Kyle Burroughs to the Los Angeles Kings for Grundstrom. Burroughs is a borderline 7th defenseman who played less than half the season for the Kings and didn't even participate in the playoffs. Meanwhile, Grundstrom is a borderline 13th forward who was healthy scratched for a couple dozen games and didn't really do much for the Sharks. So this is a trade that really doesn't do much for San Jose this season. I'd give the grade of a C. Then we move on to a couple of the free agent signings for Mike Grier, both of which were quite good, starting off with Tyler Toffoli, who just from a scoring perspective really did work out for Mike Grier. He comes in, he puts up 30 goals on the lowest scoring team in the entire league. He leads this team in terms of goal scoring just right then and there. This is already a successful free agent signing, but it is more than that as well. Toffoli comes in and joins a leadership, mentorship type of role for two of the young rookie players on this team, Macklin Celebrini and Will Smith, taking both of them under their wing with the fact that he has won a Stanley Cup. He knows what it takes to win. And talking about these type of intangible aspects of Tyler Toffoli's game, you circle back to what I had mentioned about Barclay Goodrow, but the thing is that Tyler Toffoli is actually a good player. You appreciate when he is on the ice because he can actually do good things for your team, which is not quite the same thing for Barclay Goodrow. So having a player with those type of intangible aspects to them, much preferable when they can also put the puck in the back of the net. But what really ends up making this a strong signing for the Sharks is the fact that Toffoli's contract is very reasonable. He's getting paid $6 million at the moment, and this is, at these days, for a 30-goal scorer, rather solid. But it is not a 6 or 7 year deal that's going to take him to him being 38, 39 years old, where realistically you are aware of the fact that it's going to fall off a cliff completely by the time the last 2 or 3 years of that contract roll around. Instead, Toffoli has been signed 6 years for $6 million for 4 years, and he's already got done that first season. Realistically, Toffoli should be able to maintain a similar level of performance going into next season, maybe the year after that as well, especially since the Sharks will be getting better generally as a team. And I would say worst case scenario, he falls off a little bit in that final year, at which point it's not going to be a huge deal, especially with the amount the salary cap is expected to go up over these next few seasons. To me, this was an incredibly reasonable contract for a player who brings not just a strong aspect of goal scoring to this team, but also some real leadership qualities that really helped out this roster. So while I won't say this is some absolutely outstanding free agent signing, because it is all just quite fair, it still ends up being very good at an A-. And then we move on to Alex Wennberg, a player who was brought in to help bolster the San Jose Sharks' center depth, and it ended up being incredibly necessary. Not only does Logan Couture end up missing the entirety of this season and actually essentially retiring at the end of it, but there was the injury to Macklin Celebrini at the beginning of the year for a dozen games. There was the fact that Will Smith ended up essentially just becoming a winger for the majority of this season, and then also that they traded Mikael Granlund before the last couple of months of the season. So Wennberg bounced around a lot, third line center, second line center, playing in every possible situation, penalty kill, power play, all of that. And while I don't think he necessarily knocked it out of the park, he was still pretty serviceable in all of these different areas. When it comes to his contract, obviously it is a heavy overpayment. Wennberg is not worth $5 million, but the fact is that he only ends up getting this for 2 years. So this is the contract that helps them hit the cap floor while not getting in the way of really anything, right? It actually coincides with the ending of William Eklund's entry-level contract. So even just the next big deal that the Sharks have to hand out, Wennberg will be off the books. And so this was a nice stopgap type of free agency ad. It gets the grade of a B+. Then we move on to the Cody Ceci trade. Now, this is an interesting one because depending on how you look at it, you can kind of have differing feelings. I know a lot of people like the resource asset management that Mike Grier takes. We have seen him perform these types of flips of players many times already in the 3 years that he has been with the Sharks, and this is yet another case. The Sharks picked up Ty Emberson off of waivers, then trade him to the Edmonton Oilers for Ceci and a 3rd round pick. They end up flipping Ceci for a 4th round pick, essentially at the near the deadline with the Dallas Stars, and so one could say that the Sharks got a 3rd and a 4th round pick for free. But the thing is that I was actually a decent fan of Ty Emberson as a defenseman. He looked pretty good in a somewhat small sample size last season with the Sharks, and I thought he could end up being a decent bottom pairing defenseman for the Sharks, even going into the future, especially as a righty, which is something that the Sharks do lack a lot of within their system. And as we see now, moving over to a strong playoff team like the Edmonton Oilers, not only did he manage to maintain a spot in their top 6 for pretty much the entirety of the year and got himself a new contract, but he is also playing for them in the playoffs. Now, it's not major minutes. In fact, the Oilers are usually rolling 5 defensemen, and Emberson is left with like 6-7 minutes of time on ice, but he is a young, inexperienced guy. He'll eventually get there, and it would have been nice, I feel, to hang on to that player, but I don't think it's the end of the world. I don't think he's going to become the next, best defensive defenseman in the NHL or anything, so getting a 3rd and 4th round pick out of it, not that bad, but I can't really give this grade massive marks in my opinion because of it, so it ends up getting a C+. Then we get the final move of the offseason from Mike Grier, last but definitely not least, which is the Yaroslav Askarov trade. Now, his name had been floating around for a couple of years within trade rumors, but nothing was particularly urgent up until the Nashville Predators decided to give a mega contract extension to their current starting goaltender, UC Saros. They really wanted to go for it this year. They brought on Stamkos, they brought on Marchessault, so they obviously wanted to have a more proven starter instead of trying to defer to Askarov, who might be a little bit more unpredictable due to his age this season. But because of that, it sent a clear message to Askarov that he's not going to be the starter here in Nashville for at the very least the next 5 seasons. And so those more kind of behind the scenes, boiling below the surface trade rumors now became a true public trade request. And that put a lot more pressure onto Predators general manager Barry Trotz. I had decided at that point to make a video saying that the Sharks should absolutely go out and pick up Askarov, and then the very next day, Grier did exactly that. Simply put, this was an absolute perfect fit for the Sharks roster. Being able to pick up a future starting goaltender for your team, it's not as important as, let's say, getting a number 1 center. We have seen teams in the past be able to find success even with a more average to slightly above average goalie, like the Golden Knights winning the Stanley Cup in 2023 with Adin Hill, or the Colorado Avalanche winning the Stanley Cup in 2022 with Darcy Kemper. Even the Edmonton Oilers were able to get all the way to Game 7 of the Stanley Cup Finals, being backstopped by Stuart Skinner, who is just not a particularly good goaltender at all. But what being able to get someone like Askarov does, it provides a tremendous amount of consistency. It allows you to not have to worry about this particular position, like the Tampa Bay Lightning with back-to-back cups with Vasilevsky, or Jonathan Quick with the Los Angeles Kings winning 2 cups in 3 years with the Kings. That is a very good amount of confidence to your roster. You don't want to end up like the Toronto Maple Leafs, for instance, where for multiple years, while having elite talents like Mitch Marner and Austin Matthews and William Nylander on the team, they kind of floundered a bit in the playoffs because Frederik Andersen would choke away in Game 7s, or they signed Jack Campbell, which was just a complete disaster. Only now that they have picked up Anthony Stolarz and they have Joseph Woll, who have been performing quite well for them in nets, are they finally looking to do some real damage in the playoffs. Or even just from a Sharks perspective, the 18-19 season with Martin Jones, him being shaky certainly played a part in the Sharks losing out in those playoffs, or multiple years with Antti Niemi between the pipes. If Askarov can actually pan out as expected as a top-tier starting goaltender in this league, it will add a lot of stability to this roster. And the Sharks really didn't have to give up much to bring him on. They trade pretty much just David Edstrom, as well as a first-round pick from the Vegas Golden Knights. Edstrom has had an okay season in the SHL this year, but is still looking more so as like a third-line center in the future, not a huge loss. And then the Golden Knights pick, there was some worry that this could end up being a lottery selection because the Golden Knights the previous season had just barely made the playoffs, and now they had lost Marchessault in free agency, and he was a key player for that roster. But the exact opposite ended up happening. Not only are they not a lottery team, but they even won the Pacific Division, meaning they will pick no higher than 25th overall. So a late first rounder and David Edstrom for a potential future elite starting goaltender for this roster, I would make this trade every single day of the week. That to me is an A+. Now moving on to the deals that happened actually during the season, the first of which just a couple of weeks into the year. For a second straight season, Mike Grier became very well aware quite quickly that they were going into the season without much offense coming from their blue line. Even with the addition of Jake Walman, it was still not a great look. And so he decides to make even more of a splash than he attempted the previous season with Kalen Addison by bringing in Timothy Liljegren, trading Benning a third and a sixth to bring him on. Now, I wouldn't say that this paid massive success for the Sharks. Liljegren didn't have a complete turnaround and ended up being a key offensive contributor on the back end, but he was a generally positive player, I would say. Obviously, he had his struggles. There were times where he would make a mistake and his mistakes could really stand out, but he was putting up some decent numbers, I would say, in terms of just stats, not offensive counting stats, but just sort of possession wise. And he also did have a strong end to the season, which is surprising because over the last couple of months of the season, the Sharks lost a lot of games. Liljegren still playing decently well is a good sign of things to come next year, since Liljegren is under contract for one more season. So I don't think that this was a big win for the Sharks, but it was a decent trade, I would say, giving it a B-. Then we have the Mackenzie Blackwood deal. This one happens in early December, and this was a trade that I was a big fan of, or at least a decent fan of at the time, but it has gotten worse as time has gone on. This is because the major bulk of what the Sharks get back in this deal is the second-round pick and Nikolai Kovalenko. And Kovalenko was an intriguing roster player who did have an immediate impact on the Sharks roster, but as time went on, he became a relatively consistent, healthy scratch, which seemed to really rub him the wrong way, which we saw very much so at the end of the season in public interviews and such that he gave. He was not happy with the situation here in San Jose, which sort of sent the indication that he might just be heading back to the KHL going into next season. I don't think that the Sharks can really give him the proper confirmation that he's going to be a key player on this roster next year, and I don't think he wants to stick around to find out. And so if the Sharks do lose out on Kovalenko, which is looking more and more likely as each day passes, having just gotten a second-round pick in exchange for Blackwood, not the greatest deal. On top of that, there is a certain aspect here that perhaps Mike Grier pulled the trigger a little bit too early. He could have maybe waited a month, a couple of months as we got closer to the trade deadline, and certain teams may have been more desperate for a goaltender, in particular, who the Sharks ended up trading him towards, the Colorado Avalanche. Their season was single-handedly getting tanked by Alexander Georgiev, and they were at a real danger of missing the playoffs. But then once they got Blackwood, their year completely turned around. Had the Sharks maybe waited a month, a couple of months, could they have gotten more from that trade? It's certainly possible, but it is not just a deal that benefits the Avalanche. This deal does sort of, in a backwards kind of way, benefit the Sharks as well, because up to this point, the Sharks were actually playing some decent hockey. Yes, they had started the year with 9 straight losses, but since then, they were actually an above 500 team, and Mackenzie Blackwood was a very big part of that. And so accumulating extra points, it would not have necessarily meant that the Sharks would make the playoffs. Probably, almost certainly not actually, but it could have meant climbing the standings. Remember, the Sharks lost a ton of one-goal games this season with Georgiev, who was just an absolute sieve throughout this season. Compared to Blackwood, who was playing rather well, a lot of those one-goal losses could have turned into one-goal wins. And while they wouldn't have climbed the standings tremendously, would it have been enough to pass, let's say, the Chicago Blackhawks? It is certainly possible. And as we see now with the draft order, had the Sharks not finished in last place, they would have ended up, even if they just passed Chicago, with the 3rd overall pick. And the difference this year between 3rd overall and 2nd overall is quite massive. And so it is not just a trade that benefits Colorado by allowing them to get back into the playoffs. It also sort of benefits the Sharks by giving them the perfect tank commander between the pipes, and Georgiev did his job very well. Now we move on to the Mikael Granlund trade, another situation where I do feel as though Mike Grier likely pulled the trigger a little bit too fast. This trade gets done about a week before the Four Nations face-off. It is Granlund and Ceci going to the Dallas Stars for a 4th-round pick and a 1st-round pick, notably in 2025. And the reason I say this is quite early is that teams were definitely quite desperate to try and get some talent at this year's trade deadline to head into the playoffs, and were quite overpaying for many of these players, and especially just getting it done right before the Four Nations where Granlund would be participating for Team Finland. It showed kind of a lack of confidence perhaps in Granlund as a player from Grier, because what we ended up seeing is that Granlund had a tremendous tournament with Team Finland, and in such a high stakes environment that would have absolutely raised his trade value. And then as we got closer to the deadline, we saw the Colorado Avalanche trade for Brock Nelson by giving them a 2026 first rounder, more important and valuable than a 2025 first rounder, as well as their top prospect, Callum Ritchie. Now, he's not an outstanding, future first liner, but he is still quite good. And while Nelson is a better player than Granlund, it's not by such a significant margin that really makes up this difference of value that the Islanders and the Sharks actually got. Obviously, there is the difference of the fact that the Islanders were able to retain money on this contract. Nelson only costed the Avalanche $3 million compared to Granlund's full deal of $5 million, but could the Sharks have potentially gotten a team to broker such a deal by giving them like a 4th or a 5th round pick if it meant the type of value that the Avalanche ended up receiving? It does feel like a massive missed opportunity here for Mike Grier. I still can't be so critical of this trade because the Sharks do get a first rounder, and again, it goes back to that asset management situation for Grier. This is a player who the Sharks had gotten as a salary cap dump from the Pittsburgh Penguins, so it ends up being all right, but I can't be a big fan of it still. It gets a C+. Then we get the Vitek Vanecek trade, and this certainly had all the makings of a Carl Grundstrom-esque trade, moving on from a goaltender who was not going to stick around at the end of this season and bringing on a player who was kind of a no-name, likely not to make much of an impact. But that player who they got was Patrick Giles, who surprisingly actually played rather well with the Sharks, not only on their 4th line and even getting bumped eventually up to their 3rd line, but once he got sent down to the San Jose Barracuda, he finished the season off quite solidly for them and was also one of their best, if not their best forward during the 6 games that they played in the Calder Cup playoffs, which does give some hope that Patrick Giles, he's not young enough to really be considered a prospect who's likely to get significantly better, but could he end up being a 4th liner for this team in the near future, maybe next season, for the next couple of years until some of the other younger guys are more ready? It is certainly possible, and that is definitely more valuable than what holding on to Vitek Vanecek would have brought, which is absolutely nothing, and so this to me does get a C+. Then we have the Vinnie Hinostroza trade. This was one that at the time I really wasn't thinking much of. I thought it was the only thing that was really going to bring is a roadblock for some of the Sharks' younger defensemen to actually get a roster spot, because I really didn't think very highly of Hinostroza as a defenseman, but he did surprise in the few games he got with the Sharks before getting injured. I didn't think I was going to like him. I thought he'd just be another Jan Rutta clone, but he was a significant upgrade over Jan Rutta, and so now moving into next season, I could certainly see him being able to hold down a bottom pairing spot for the San Jose Sharks, and he is on an expiring contract. It's a little bit expensive at $2 million, but one that I imagine most playoff teams would be able to swallow, especially since the Sharks will have a retention slot if necessary to make something like that work. And if the Sharks can get back the 5th round pick that they had originally given in this trade with the Penguins, it won't be like a great deal, but it'll at least be even. And perhaps if they can get like a 4th or maybe even a 3rd, depending on how well Hinostroza plays, that would be a pretty big win. So to me, this still not great, but a C+. Then we have the Nico Sturm trade. The Sharks trade Nico Sturm to the Florida Panthers along with a 7th round pick for a 4th round pick. The only thing that I was critical of in this deal is the fact that the Sharks had to add that sweetener. Kind of strange that they had to add the 7th round pick, but then again, I'm not the one working behind the scenes. I'm not the one having calls with 31 general managers, and so for all I know, every single GM in the league turned Mike Grier down, and it was only the Florida GM who called back and said, hey, if you add a 7th round pick, let's make this work. I can't possibly have that information, and really a 7th round pick is such the lowest of possible low values that it's not really breaking the bank here. It gets the grade of a C, not much to think of it. Then we have the Jake Walman 2.0 trade, because this is the second time that Walman gets moved in a few months. The first that the Sharks acquiring him, and the second one in which they send him over to the Edmonton Oilers. Now, the first reaction that I had to this deal was a little bit underwhelming. Again, when you speak from an asset management point of view, this is still a huge win. The Sharks got Walman for free along with a 2nd rounder, and then flipping him for a 1st round pick. That's basically getting a 1st and 2nd rounder for having absolutely done nothing. That's like a huge win in anyone's books, but seeing how well Walman did play with the Sharks through those first few months, even having to fill in some pretty big shoes as their number one defenseman, and with how much teams were overpaying at this year's trade deadline, I did feel as though Walman could have potentially gotten a little bit more than this. And so the fact that while this is a 2026 first rounder, so it does have more value than if they got a 2025 first rounder, the fact that that's all they got, a little bit underwhelming, but still a pretty good trade in general, so I'll give it a B. Then we have the Luke Kunin deal, very much similar to that of Nico Sturm, but the Sharks do not have to add in a 7th round pick this time. They just get a 4th rounder from the Columbus Blue Jackets. Not much to say here. Really, the best news out of it is the fact that Luke Kunin is no longer a San Jose Shark. It gets a C. And then finally, we have the last trade of the season, the one that got in just under the deadline of the trade deadline, like mere seconds before it actually expired, that being the Fabian Zetterlund trade. My immediate reaction to this one was extremely negative. Didn't make much sense to me, and it hasn't really gotten much better since then. Basically, the Sharks trade Zetterlund and a 4th rounder to the Senators for a Stapchuk and a 2nd rounder. And since this is a Sharks 4th rounder and a Senators 2nd rounder, it's only going to be jumping up about 50 slots. And so that value needs to be made up by the difference between a Stapchuk and Zetterlund, and it is a significant difference. Zetterlund is a proven 20-goal, 40-point scorer. I was maybe not as high on Zetterlund as other Sharks fans, but I still viewed him as like a solid 3rd liner into the future for this team. Meanwhile, Ostapchuk, while being incredibly hyped up by Mike Grier, and he views him as the future 3rd line, stalwart, penalty-killing type of guy on this roster for the next decade plus, we really didn't see any sort of inklings of that actually being the case. He played about a dozen games with the San Jose Sharks, was extremely unremarkable during every single one of those games, and then once getting bumped down to the San Jose Barracuda, where you would expect an uptick in performance and in scoring, simply because a player who can have success on a team NHL 4th line should be playing well in the AHL, like we saw with Patrick Giles, for instance. He was pretty good in the AHL and then managed to really crush it in the AHL with the Barracuda. We did not see that from Ostapchuk. Still very, very underwhelming. I do know that he was supposedly injured. I'm not entirely sure what the injury was, but he was playing through something, and maybe that did hold him back quite significantly. Hopefully that is the reason. And then also there is the idea that when the Sharks originally actually acquired Zetterlund in the Timo Meier trade, the first 20 or so games he played at the end of that season for the Sharks were an absolute disaster. He did not look even remotely salvageable as a player. And then the very next season he came out and put up 40 points and 20 goals and all was well. If that similar thing could happen with Zach Ostapchuk, obviously all will be forgiven. But right now, you're not really seeing much signs of that being the case. Now, on the other side of the coin, it's not as though Zetterlund is really lighting it up with the Senators. He put up no points for them in the playoffs, only a couple during the final stretch of the regular season. But as I said, Zetterlund seems to take a little bit of time to get acclimated to a new team. I suspect that if the Senators hold on to him, he should be putting up some decent point totals next year, and hopefully Ostapchuk can follow suit. But this is still a trade that is looked at quite unfavorably. Maybe we'll revisit it in a couple of years and things will change, but right now it is a D-. The only thing that keeps this from an F is the fact that Zetterlund is not like a huge piece of the San Jose Sharks' future. I don't think that this was a massive loss for the team, but a loss nonetheless. And so in terms of a final total grade here for Mike Grier, obviously there were a lot of home run moves. The trade up to 11th overall and the acquisition of Yaroslav Askarov are not only big wins for the team, but ones that will affect this roster for many years into the future. These are not short-term gains, but long-term gains for the team. There were then a chunk of these kind of underwhelming style of trades, Granlund, Cody Ceci, Mackenzie Blackwood, ones where the Sharks do get good value back, but maybe a little bit of a missed opportunity. A few of these sort of more balanced trades that don't do much of anything, like Sturm and Kunin, and then a couple of really bad ones in the case of Goodrow and Zetterlund. All in all, though, because I think the positives are so positive, it does trend more so in the right direction here. I'll give Mike Grier the solid grade of a B. Class dismissed.